organization in Arizona طبعا مثل من كلكم دي تنتهي سلام عليكم آخر زا وعزيزة نيكولاس الجيلو دي من أستراليا مقرون أن همزمية تراب السودان بس تشقيت الدين ومو ما أخرن أودخ مبدأتي كبالخ أمتها توريتا أو بسيمة نيكولاس هدية مشارك. We would like to do the Pledge of Allegiance in Kolokhom Asin Kalita Kolokhom. We'll move out of the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
هذه عاطف أمتها.
Salmat shubatan, sortat slawatan, roshmat dayutan, ativat muhabti, atan chabita, bimromet cherutan, bimayer bibaru yachanana tawa, min kula agani, min kula ruchi, madchaf bardisha, dochen kodetli, kmarti wen chaya, خط النشغيا تيشت مولمتا تيشت خودشتا خطاني تبرختا العالم شبختا مجفن وطني مجفن يطني أتبت نهرين أتقدشتا أتبت نهرين أتقدشتا.
In Masa character, a moment of silence, but then said at the end. How are you to see it? بس بين ما تخيل مخرجات خرجت أخنا متكسلة مردود سنة تعاطرت أمريكية أريزونا أخنا مريض زخنون. We the seminars or lectures Madonna Itlan Assyrian Basketball Association of Arizona Kut Khoshiba with Deer Valley High School week 10 and the 12 seasons of basketball the Deer Valley 51st Avenue Union Hills Itlan Makretet Lishana Itlan Rabbi Joseph Hermes Makroya Itlan Sharet Dayarka إتلان مقالة ليشانا قدر سورة يقطع شموني ونعدم عين إلى أي من بنت الدين قدر يخرج الدين أنا من راو من شولان أخر ما يوسف وهلبت مختخ ميو يقول نيكولاس الجيلو ورابا يالا جونكو وخامات الدين دينا آتي لخا ومقروي أنا من رابا سودانا قد يوخم هذه طلابا من يقرأ جوزيف هرمس باقر لخا البيمة فمقروكم خدش خبرا.
السلام عليكم. شايفتنتي كلهم اللي قبل ضيبوتا ربطة من كلهم خطيتوها اللخا. أي جمعت ربنا حتى أنا بخشاون سبب أن نبذ دمنبانا نقص الجيلو دارش الله يديو. ربنا قاينا أطوراي بريشاي أطوراي الأمريكا بريشاي أطوراي كده قالوا تنسو. قد أخذون دتهم بداية قم يقرأ ملحانا نيكولاس الجيلو with the master's degree دي Syriac Christianity in the Church of East Architecture from Leiden University ودي بروح له PhD دي بيخشون ياخذ 5 من University of Sydney go Syriac Studies يعني دراسة سورياية دراسة أطوراية و أسست يعني بوصاية دي يود أطوراية أورميا وتشقيت دي من شغلت زرته من ديانة من inscriptions دي وال tombstones من ديانة أطوراي ديان من قام إما وخمشيش إنه إماش إنه و this is the first time بخشان هي وترلبو لما وخدشة inscriptions ده كم كاتونا كم قارشين شفت دي وكو PhD دي وخلت هذا قرب دانا بسمني له وقتها دي رشماعيد قد كنا شد باي سنين قد قارد ديانة فتشو بتشقيت الأورميا أطوراي الأورميا ما سيد كده أنا من ديانة متقري النبذة دي مدبانا نيكولاس الجيلو بالدارش الله رابع أنا قاينا أنا بشانا يمن بلطف مخا برابط تخمينيات خاتب هاوينا نحن شو شاطت توريتا فريشا يدلو قالوتا وشولان وواليتا توريتا bush بتوخ ظهري ربيه. So without further ado, ملبانا نيكولاس الجيلو.
How Basima, Birgit Joseph, قد introduction لها student مقرولة تلقوا بالطيب طرفها من باكستا من متعنيت أطراي أريزونا شتا مقرولة هذه الحلقات النخا تلقوا بالطيب من كلهم قد ديرة النخا ولها مزمتا شاريته بين أمرنا خون قد أهم زمتا بالمريزون بلشان الإنجليز. So همزمتها بتوعي بلشان الإنجليز. أخشي بس وين يخارب هذا من دي presentation دي مثلا. So first of all, thank you all again for coming to this lecture, which is titled Assyrians Today, Between Homeland and Diaspora. Please forgive me for my Australian accent. Okay. I tried hard to learn the American accent, but I can't get it right. So, without further ado, an ancient Greek saying, often attributed to Socrates, says, "Know thyself." Knowledge is power, and to know who you are is to empower yourself. This will be a recurring theme throughout this talk. In the last century or more, Assyrians have endured an extraordinary amount of violence, population movement, and destruction of cultural heritage. It has been estimated that this has occurred to them at least once every 20 or so odd years in its recent history. Since the 19th century, however, these events have grown more and more devastating as the nationalistic ambitions of their Kurdish, Arab, and Turkish neighbors have gradually risen, and since the Assyrians have become embroiled in conflicts between parties that do not concern them and over which they have no control. Such man-made disasters have included the following ones which I've listed here. So massacres by Kurdish warlords such as Muhammad Pasha of Rawandus, Badr Khambek, the genocide, the Somalia massacre, and other conflicts up until the present. So you can see it never ends. This lecture will examine the current situation of the Assyrians both in the Middle East and the diaspora, as well as the struggle to maintain and preserve the ancient language and culture of the Assyrians. It will also explore the possible fate of the Assyrian people and discuss the urgent need for language and cultural preservation, as well as maintaining indigenous Assyrian communities in the Middle East. Now, firstly, what is a homeland? A homeland, or a native land, is the concept of the place to which an ethnic group holds a long history and a deep cultural association with. The country in which a particular national identity began. The areas which constitute the Assyrian homeland are, as many of us may know, adjoining parts of northern Iraq, but not only Iraq, also southeastern Turkey, northwest Iran, and northeastern Syria. Prior to the Assyrian genocide, many districts within these areas were inhabited predominantly by Assyrian majorities in compact groups of villages and towns. Among them were the Hakkari Highlands, the Tur Abdin Plateau in Turkey, the plains of Urmia and Salamas in Iran, and the Nineveh Plains in Iraq. Today, all but Hakkari have retained minuscule native Assyrian populations. So Hakkari and Van are now empty of Assyrians, but you still find small Assyrian communities in most of the other areas. So here is a table basically with estimates of how many Assyrians live in the Middle East. countries, in the four main countries in the Middle East, which make up the Assyrian homeland. And I've emphasized, for example, areas of each country which are considered part of the traditional Assyrian heartland. So, Urmi and Salamas in Iran, of course, which is very important for our history, southeastern Turkey, or Turkish Mesopotamia, the Syrian Jazeera, or Syrian Mesopotamia, and northern Iraq. If anybody wants these statistics later on, I'd be happy to pass them on. Now, of the more than 2.75 million Christian Assyrians in the world today, from all the various churches, little more than 1.25 million, maybe 45% of the Assyrians, remain in the Middle East. Of these, some 300,000, so 24%, are refugees. 200,000 are internally displaced, with more than 550,000 living in war-torn areas. This leaves only about 400,000 Assyrians, so only 16% of the Assyrians that are still in the Middle East, who are living in relative peace and stability in places like northern Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. This does not bode well for the future sustainability and continued presence of Assyrian communities in the Middle East in general. In Iraq, Assyrians and Chaldeans are recognized in the country's constitution, and Christians have the right to 5 seats in the national parliament and a ministry in the cabinet. This isn't ideal, and the constitution includes many articles which contradict one another, such as making Islam the official religion of all legislation and lawmaking. Compared with the previous regime, however, which didn't even recognize Assyrians as an ethnic group, this is still a small improvement. In the Iraqi Kurdistan Autonomous Region, Christians have been reserved 5 seats and a ministry. Whilst the Syrians since 1991 in the north and since 2003 in the rest of the country have been able to set up their own schools and cultural centers and civil society organizations, including a Syriac Studies Department at the University of Baghdad and the Syriac Museum in Erbil. These face numerous challenges from majority groups, especially the Kurds. Up to 200 Assyrians in Iraq are also internally displaced, and efforts to create an Assyrian autonomous unit in the Nineveh Plain, where a large concentration of indigenous communities live, have yet to come to fruition. So a little bit about Iran now. In Iran, Assyrians have been recognized as an indigenous ethno-religious minority since the country's 1908 constitutional reform, and since then have had the right to representation in the country's majlis, or parliament. This is current today, and the Assyrians also have the right to own and run private schools, with 2 in the capital, Tehran, and 2 in Urmi. There are also 10 Assyrian associations in cities throughout the country, linked to the central one in Tehran. And there are retirement homes also in Urmi and Tehran. The Iranian government has also paid a lot of money to restore historic Assyrian churches, which have been placed on Iran's national heritage list. And it even funds the yearly Tammuz Games in Urmia, which attract Assyrian sporting teams not only from all over Iran, but also from Iraq, Armenia, Georgia, Russia, and previously Syria. There are, however, instances where Assyrians may face discrimination because of their religion, since they live under an Islamic system of government, but otherwise, Iran is very different. Now, Syria. In Syria, Assyrians are recognized according to their sectarian divisions. So if you belong to the Church of the East, you're Ashuri. If you belong to the Chaldean Church, you're Kildani. If you belong to the Syrian Orthodox or Syrian Catholic Church, you're Syriani. But they're not recognized as a unified ethnic group or nation. There are also 2 Assyrian members in the parliament, at least last time I checked, in 2010, and 1 minister in the country's cabinet. The Syrian Orthodox Church runs about 8 private schools in major cities and towns, and the Church of the East also has 1 school. Education in rural areas is usually conducted by local teachers during the summer holidays. Currently, the Jazeera area, which is basically this area over here, so it's between the Euphrates and the Tigris, it's actually Mesopotamia. The Jazeera area is controlled by Islamist jihadist rebels and Kurdish factions, with government control in some small pockets. Many Assyrians have been kidnapped or killed in the current chaos, and thousands have escaped to Turkey and Lebanon, emptying out a number of our villages. Turkey. In Turkey, Assyrians are not recognized as a minority, and they thus have no right to own or run their own private schools in the country. The Syrian Orthodox Church, however, does manage to utilize its monasteries in the southeast of the country to teach local children the language on weekends. There is currently one Assyrian Member of Parliament, Erol Dora, who was recently elected through the efforts of a pro-Kurdish political party. Additionally, there are other countries in the Middle East, obviously. Assyrians are officially recognized as minorities in countries such as Lebanon and Israel, according to their sectarian divisions. And we also have private schools in Beirut and Bethlehem. The major problem for Assyrians in the Middle East, I'm sure you would all know, is immigration. Without proper recognition by their governments, without the rule of law, without the ability to appropriately defend themselves and their villages from attack, hundreds of thousands of Assyrians have voted with their feet and now wait for visas for Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, European countries. The conditions that await them in the diaspora are no better, since they are faced with dispersion, language loss, estrangement from their homelands and cultures, and imminent assimilation. So, let's go to the diaspora. What is a diaspora? A diaspora, from a Greek word meaning dispersion, is a scattered population with a common origin in a smaller geographic area. They are involuntarily, so not by their own will, they are involuntarily dispersed outside of their original homeland. A diaspora is a transnational community that defines itself as a singular ethnic group based upon its shared identity. Ethnic diaspora communities are now recognized by many scholars as inevitable and endemic features of the current international system. Recently, scholarship has distinguished between different kinds of diasporas. I'm not going to go too much into it, but some are caused by imperialism, some are caused by trade or labor or chain migration. But it's important to note that some diaspora communities maintain strong political ties with their homelands. Other qualities that may be typical of many diasporas are thoughts of returning, relationships with other communities of the same ethnic groups in the diaspora, and lack of full assimilation into their host countries. Now, self-identified diasporas place great importance on their homelands because of their ethnic and cultural associations with it, similar to what we do, especially if their homeland has been lost or conquered by another group. This has led ethnic nationalist movements within several diasporas, and that's the same thing with us, which long for the establishment of a sovereign homeland. Now, let's go through some Assyrian diasporas. The oldest surviving Assyrian diaspora community was established by a merchant named Thomas of Cana, who in 345 AD migrated to southern India to help replenish the local Christian community. With him, he took about 400 people who belonged to 72 families and from 7 clans, a bishop named Mariosep, 4 priests and many deacons. Their descendants are now known as the Knanaya community, and they number more than 300,000. Okay, almost all of them belong to the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church. These ones don't belong to the Church of the East. Whilst they no longer speak Assyrian, they have kept traditions which distinguish them from other South Indian Christians, and they don't intermarry with one another. So they're endogamous. One of the other earliest Assyrian diasporas in modern times was formed by the forced removal of an estimated 100,000 Assyrians from the Urmia region to Shahryar in Khorasan by Nadir Shah of Iran between 1732 and 1736. Many Assyrians died along the way, however, and those that survived either returned back to Urmia after the time was over, or they converted to Islam and assimilated into the local population. Being farmers, with no specific wealth or skills, no education, no national awareness, they were unable to maintain themselves as a distinct community. A century before them, on the other hand, under Shah Abbas of Persia, hundreds of thousands of Armenians and Georgians were forcibly transferred to central Iran. So they were forcibly transferred to this area here. Now, these Armenians, being very skillful and wealthy merchants, and the Georgians, being hardened warriors, both communities were able to maintain their cultures and languages, so far removed from their original homelands, which is sort of up there, and they brought them here. So even today, you find in the center of Iran, Armenians and Georgians that are descended from those people who still speak their languages, even though the Georgians have converted to Islam. It's very interesting. You know, the Assyrians that were brought after them 100 years, and you can see the arrow there, to that part of Iran from Urmi, they completely assimilated. The next oldest surviving diasporas are in the Middle East, and they're represented by the communities in Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. These began in the 1700s and have been replenished with new waves of migrants until today. Next are the communities in the former Soviet Union, especially Georgia. Started from basically a few dozen families that migrated there in 1770, and they were joined by more families in 1828 after the wars between Russia and Iran. These new settlers established villages not only in Georgia, but also in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. After this, further communities were established in Egypt under the rule of Muhammad Ali Pasha, 1805 to 1848, in the USA, as early as 1882, probably earlier, and there you can see one of the earliest Assyrian associations in the United States, and in Canada in 1902. The next oldest diaspora communities were established after World War I, after the genocide, by survivors from the genocide, between 1919 and 1924, and they include France, the UK, Jordan, and Greece. Unlike their Armenian or Jewish neighbors, the Assyrians were slow to establish communities in Europe and the New World. This is most likely due to the fact that they were not as numerous, not as urbanized, were not as renowned as artisans or craftsmen, and were not as savvy in mercantile enterprises. Prior to the First World War, most Assyrians outside Urmia and the few cities in northern Mesopotamia were illiterate farmers. In many of the cities especially, most of the Assyrians spoke Arabic, Turkish, or Armenian, and felt no connection with the Aramaic-speaking Assyrians living in the surrounding villages. For example, the native Assyrians of Mosul, who are Arabic-speaking, looked down upon the Assyrians in the villages around their city, and they called them Falahi min Ahl Bagha, or farmers and outsiders. Similarly, the Arabic-speaking Assyrians of Mardin and its villages looked down upon the Assyrians of Tur Abdin, who spoke Assyrian, and they used to call them Tawarme, mountaineers. You know, this situation was lamented by Chaldean Bishop Murad Deishir in the introduction to his History of Chaldea and Assyria, Tarikh Kaldu Athur, which he published in 1912. This lack of homogeneity and internal national unity, was further exacerbated by sectarian divisions and disputes between and within the individual Assyrian churches. Thus, the Assyrians separated into various smaller groups, and they would thus not be able to pool their efforts and resources in order to create successful diaspora institutions that would preserve their language and culture. Professor Ashur Yusuf, who's up there on the screen, was the editor of the Assyrian monthly magazine, Murshid Athuriyun, the Assyrian Guide, published at Kharput in Turkey between 1909 and 1915. He spoke candidly about this, and also about identity fragmentation. In his article, Reasons for the Backwardness of the Assyrians, published on 20th of October 1914, he writes the following. I think you can see it up there. The hindrance to the development of the Assyrians was not so much the attacks from without as it was from within. The doctrinal and sectarian disputes and struggles is a good example. These caused divisions, spiritually and nationally, among the people who quarreled amongst themselves, even to the point of shedding blood, thus creating a permanent schism. To this very day, the Assyrians are still known by various names, such as Nestorians, Jacobites, Chaldeans, etc. These dissensions sapped the physical and moral energy of the people and destroyed the sources of enlightenment, namely promising educational institutions. I should note that Professor Ashur Yusuf was not from the Church of the East, he was Syrian Orthodox. Now, in the 20th century, and especially since the Semel massacre in 1933, many Assyrian churches have formed and developed their own identities based on church affiliation, such as the Chaldean and Aramean nations. This has led to a crystallization and affiliation of the Assyrian identity solely within the Church of the East. Religion in general has been a major setback to Assyrian cohesion by further excluding all those who are not even Christian. It may or may not surprise you to know that there are more than 150,000 Aramaic-speaking Jews in Israel who originate from villages and towns in and around the Assyrian homeland. These communities are not new and can be dated to the conversion to Judaism of the Assyrian royal family of Arbel in the 1st century AD. Often, the dialects these Jews speak are mutually intelligible with what is spoken by most Eastern Assyrians. Now you can see that picture up there is the tomb of the queen of Arbel who converted to Judaism, and that is the inscription from her tomb. This is in the museum in Jerusalem. So the inscription on her tomb is actually in Assyrian. It says her name, Sadan Malikta, for those that know how to read the Strangeli. And here you have a few of the Jews that speak Surat in Israel, dressed exactly like, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Julat Khumala, Shalo Shapek, dancing with Dolo Zorna. Now, due to the exclusivity of the Assyrian identity and its strong bond with Christianity, these Assyrian Jews identify as Kurdish, Kurdistani, or Aramaic Jews instead. There has been minimal to no attempt at outreach or relations towards these communities on the part of the Christian Assyrians. Armenians, on the other hand, have been active in maintaining relations with a group of Muslim Armenians or Islamized Armenians in Turkey called the Hemshirli, who still speak Armenian. So now I'm going to go towards the diaspora. At present, there are about 1.5 million Assyrians, Christian Assyrians, living in the diaspora, scattered in between 40 to 50 countries throughout the world. Of these, you have about 700,000 in North America, 450,000 in Europe, about 150,000 in Oceania, so Australia, New Zealand, etc., and 100,000 in Latin America. Large concentrations of Assyrians can thus be found in, I'm not going to say the whole list of countries, but we know where they are. In many of these and other countries, Assyrians have assimilated and no longer identify with their origins. In general, stateless ethnic diaspora communities have often found it difficult to maintain their language, identity, or culture past the 3rd generation. Whilst it does certainly help when there is a nation state to help sponsor or direct educational and cultural programs towards their expatriate communities, this is not vital. In Sydney, Assyrians have opened one primary and one high school, the Church of the East. They also have a childcare centre and a retirement village. And they also have a welfare centre and a library. There is also an Assyrian library in Chicago. A high school was established by the Assyrians in Los Angeles, but it was closed a few years later due to lack of sustainability. The Syrian Orthodox Church now has plans to establish a private school in New Jersey, and very soon we are going to see the establishment of the first private Assyrian school in the town of Södertälje in Sweden. There are also, however, Saturday or Sunday schools in many diaspora communities to teach the language, and Assyrian language courses are offered in many public schools in Europe, Australia, and the United States. Assyrian diaspora communities have so far been more active in establishing churches, halls, clubs, associations, and in organizing themselves. They have been more active as well in local and international political affairs, lobbying efforts, and sending aid to refugees and Middle Eastern communities. Unfortunately, Assyrians have not been as active on the educational front, and there are no privately funded Assyrian studies chairs at any university anywhere in the world. This is a disturbing pattern, which does not bode well for the future of such diaspora communities. By far, the biggest threat to Assyrian diaspora communities is cultural assimilation. This is the process by which a person or a group's language and/or culture come to resemble those of another group. The term can refer either to immigrant diasporas or to native residents that come to be culturally dominated by another society. So it can apply to Assyrians either in the diaspora or in the homeland. Assimilation may involve either a quick or gradual change, depending on the circumstances. Full assimilation occurs when new members of the society become indistinguishable from members of the other group. As noted, a major factor in this process is language shift, also called language transfer or language replacement or assimilation. This is the process whereby a community of speakers of one language becomes bilingual in another language and gradually shifts to speaking that other language. Often languages which are seen to be of higher status stabilize or spread at the expense of the other languages which their own speakers perceive as being of lower status. When a linguistic community ceases to use their original language, the scholarly community calls that language death. Language shift can be detrimental to at least parts of the community associated with it. Sociolinguists report that language shift, when it involves loss of the first language, can lead to cultural disintegration and a variety of social problems, including increased alcoholism, dysfunctional families, and increased incidence of premature death. A tendency to bring up children as monolingual speakers of a different language, so not the native language, can lead them to holding their heritage and their language, their original language, in disdain, and feeling ashamed of the language of their parents and grandparents. As a result, some of them would feel neither fully part of the country they live in, nor fully part of their own ethnic group. So there's a little bit on language shift. So on the other hand, social integration. Social integration is the movement of minority groups such as ethnic minorities, refugees, and underprivileged sections of a society into the mainstream. This requires proficiency in an accepted common language of the society, acceptance of the laws of the society, and adoption of a common set of values. It does not require assimilation. So you can be fully integrated into a society. Assyrians can be fully integrated into America without fully losing their culture and assimilating and becoming Americans or becoming white. In tolerant and open societies, members of minority groups can often use social integration to gain full access to the opportunities, rights, and services available to the members of mainstream society. Recent research also shows that immigrants should be independent and proactive in order to achieve better social integration within their host countries. So it shouldn't be a top-down, it should be bottom-up. So solutions for the homeland and diaspora. It is important that Assyrians maintain indigenous communities in the Middle East and do all they can to preserve their cultural heritage in the form of buildings, artifacts, etc., wherever possible. This would mean taking charge and being active in locating these, compiling lists and inventories of them, and monitoring them, as well as restoring and maintaining churches, monasteries, cemeteries, historic homes, and establishing museums and libraries to house Assyrian manuscripts, handcrafts, and other items. This is already being done by Armenians in Turkey and Jews in Europe and elsewhere. Other communities in the Middle East, and especially those within the limits of the traditional Assyrian heartland, represent an unbroken chain of Assyrian habitation, however large or small in number. So what I'm trying to say is, when you see Assyrians living in an area in the Middle East, that means they represent an unbroken chain from when Assyrians were first there until today. And if we lose them, we lose that part of our history. These are some photos from a village in southeastern Turkey called Kafro Tahtayto, or Lower Kafro, in the region of Tur Abdin. Its inhabitants fled to Europe in the 1970s and 1960s. It was after 2000, I think, that the people from the village decided to come back and rebuild their houses. They didn't get rid of their Turkish citizenship. They still had their Turkish citizenship, but they used it, they went back, they built these villas, and now many of them have actually moved back, if not for just the summer, but for the whole year. And this is just one example of the Assyrian villages that have been resettled in that area. So I was going to say, even if Assyrians don't return to resettle their villages, it's still important for them to maintain constant and close relations with the land and the communities still living on it, so that they don't feel isolated and abandoned from the rest of their people. Here, Assyrians can obviously learn from the Armenians, since hundreds of Armenians still conduct yearly pilgrimages to their abandoned churches and monasteries in eastern Turkey. It would also be a good idea for young Assyrians to get active in organizations that already make a difference to sending aid and building infrastructure in the homeland, such as the Assyrian Aid Society. The most pressing issue, however, when it comes to language and cultural preservation, remains the Assyrians in the diaspora. Assyrians in the Middle East are naturally kept segregated because they primarily have a different religion to the majority of their neighbours, with the exception of Lebanon. This aids in language preservation and slows down the process of assimilation into other cultures. Not to mention the fact that the establishment of schools in the Middle East is easier. It's cheaper, there are more people there, less distances travelled, etc. I should also like to stress that Assyrians living in their own villages and in their own areas in cities are less likely to assimilate and more likely to preserve their language and culture. A case in point here would be the Amish in the United States, who have their own communities and still speak their own language, and the Armenians in the Middle East, or the Jews in medieval Europe. In lieu of that, okay, we don't want to form ghettos, we want to live with everyone else. The only solution is to set up a proper system of schools which teach Assyrian, complemented by the increase of media outlets where the language can be continuously used. So, books, newspapers, magazines, etc. Media will also serve to keep the scattered Assyrian communities connected and informed about one another. It often surprises me how little many Assyrians know about other Assyrians in other countries, or from other churches, or even from other districts or villages. They don't know. Genealogy should also be mentioned. Many younger Assyrians don't know anything beyond their own grandparents, losing much of their links with their extended families overseas, as well as their own family history and tangible links to the homeland. Many don't even really know where their families originated from and what significance these places have, often hiding behind the guise of ignorant nationalism. Oh, I don't care, you know, Al-Jeloo, Al-Jeloo, you know. They should at least be proud of where they come from in the homeland. Now, this lack of knowledge, or lack of knowing about yourselves, I come back to the issue of knowing yourself, only perpetuates the lack of pride in heritage and lack of confidence in identity. So education as a solution. The first modern Assyrian schools were established in Urmi in the mid-1830s by foreign missions. Prior to that, only males with church ranks were able to read or write, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 women. About 70 years later, in 1908, roughly 80% of both Assyrian men and women in Urmia were literate, which is actually more than many countries in the Middle East today. Assyrians had been printing literature there since 1840, and in 1849 they established Iran's first newspaper. So Iran's first newspaper was not in Persian, it was in Assyrian, it was called Zahrir al-Bara. On the eve of World War I, the Urmia region boasted more doctors, most of them Assyrian, than all of Iran put together, and had even begun to export them to other provinces of the country. They were highly educated, modernizing, empowered, and confident in their future. The Urmia region was later followed in the 1840s by education systems run by the Chaldean Catholic Church and the Syrian Orthodox and Catholic churches. These schools later produced Assyrian thinkers and national leaders such as Professor Asher Yusuf, who we talked about before, Na'um Faiq, Sanharib Bali, David Barsoum Perley, Yusuf Malik, and others. According to Horatio Southgate, and no, that's not Horatio Southgate, the story of the establishment of the Syrian Orthodox schools goes like this. So when the Syrian Orthodox Patriarch was in Istanbul in 1838, the Armenian Patriarch, this guy, expostulated with him on the state of the nation, and among other things said to him, "A people without schools must eventually decline. A people without schools must eventually decline." This remark sank deep into the mind of the Patriarch and was never forgotten. On his journey home, he visited most of the places where the Syrians are to be found, and in every place he established a school. In 1899, Syrian Orthodox immigrants to New Jersey established the Assyrian National School Association, later called the Assyrian Orphanage and School Association of America. This organization initially funded, ran and owned a school for Assyrian orphans in the Turkish city of Adana. That's the one up there. However, in 1933 it was transferred to Beirut. That's the modern school, the modern Assyrian National School Association school in Beirut. Today, the association sends aid to its own school in Lebanon, as well as schools, orphanages and monasteries owned and run by the Syrian Orthodox Church in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, and Israel-Palestine. It also provides many other services. Now, whilst it has been operational for the past 114 years, this association, I just wanted to say, only serves Assyrians from the Syrian Orthodox Church. It doesn't care about Assyrians from other churches. Not that it doesn't care, but it just hasn't expanded to Assyrians from other churches, unfortunately. Now, quickly, I'll turn to the efforts of two highly successful diaspora nations, the Armenians and the Jews, just as case studies, in an effort to show how it's not necessary to have a nation state in order to create such institutions outside of the homeland. Now, Armenian education began in the early 19th century, initially under the direction of lay committees. These committees had community projects and not only included schools, but also hospitals and other institutions. The Armenians, in addition to paying taxes to their own states, voluntarily imposed extra burdens on themselves in order to support such philanthropic agencies. These educational and philanthropic agencies made the Armenians the most educated and wealthy group in the Ottoman Empire, and by 1912 they possessed over 1,996 Armenian schools with more than 170,000 students. One of the main supporters of Armenian education has been the Armenian General Benevolent Union, the AGBU. This is a non-profit organization which was established in Cairo, in Egypt, of all places, in 1906. Its headquarters are now in New York. Its goal was to establish a union that would in every way assist the Armenian people, the future of which, as a minority in the Ottoman Empire, was endangered. So back in 1906, these people figured, well, you know, our future is endangered. I think that rings true for us as well. Between 1906 and 1912, the AGBU provided Armenian villages in the Ottoman Empire with seeds, with agricultural instruments, and established schools and orphanages. The Union also managed to render tangible help to survivors of the Armenian genocide, especially orphans. After World War I, the main goal of the Union was to preserve and promote the Armenian language, identity and heritage through educational, cultural and humanitarian programs. The Union established educational institutions, a foundation to provide scholarships for Armenians to study in European universities, and also a student dormitory in Paris. Now I'm going to come to student dormitories. Now, AGBU activities aimed at national preservation became more effective through the establishment of cultural funds, through which a number of educational and other establishments were built. Today, the AGBU has chapters in 80 cities of 22 countries in the world, with 22,000 members, 120 branches, 27 cultural centers, spread through the US, Europe, Middle East, South America, and Australia. Private schools with nearly more than 6,500 students, 15 Saturday schools. They finance more than 16 educational establishments in Paris, New York. Paris and New York, the AGBU has 2 libraries. It also awards scholarship grants and loans to more than 500 Armenian students worldwide. With an annual international budget of $36 million, the AGBU preserves and promotes the Armenian identity and heritage through educational, cultural and humanitarian programs, annually serving some 400,000 Armenians in 35 countries. So in total, just quickly, Armenians in the whole world have about 77 primary schools outside of Armenia, 19 intermediate schools, 34 high schools, 1 college and 1 university. There's an Armenian university in Beirut, Lebanon. These are spread all over the world. In addition to this, Armenian communities in North America have funded 16 chairs for Armenian studies in universities all across the United States, as well as 3 community colleges. There are also a number of Armenian studies associations, institutes, research centers, a genocide museum, and the library and museum located in Washington, D.C. and in Boston. So, now to Jewish education. The first Jewish day school was established in New York in 1731, so pretty early on. Later on, in the early 19th century, this developed in Germany, largely in response to the higher emphasis in general on secular studies. Later on, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, or the AIU, became a driving force in the establishment of new Jewish schools. This is a Paris-based international Jewish organization founded in 1860. So do we see a pattern here? In 1906, the Armenians established the AGBU. Armenia didn't exist. In 1860, the Alliance was established. Israel didn't exist. So a lot of Assyrians use the excuse, you know, it's a cop-out, basically. So they were established in 1860 to safeguard the human rights of Jews around the world. The organization promotes the ideals of Jewish self-defense and self-sufficiency through education and professional development. As outlined in its prospectus, the program of the society included the emancipation of the Jews from oppressive and discriminating laws, political disabilities, and defense of them in those countries where they were subjected to persecution. The motto of the organization is, all Jews bear responsibility for one another. They shouldn't bear responsibility for anyone else, and no one's going to take responsibility for them other than themselves. From its establishment, the Alliance embarked on a civilizing mission to advance the Jews of the Middle East through French education and culture. For the attainment of its objectives, the Society proposed to carry on a campaign of education through the press and by the publication of works on the history and life of the Jews. It opened its first school, if anybody can guess where, it opened up its first school in Tétouan, in Morocco, in 1862. Within 40 years, by 1900, the Alliance was operating 100 schools with a combined student population of 26,000 from Morocco all the way to Iran. Its greatest efforts were concentrated in the Middle East, providing Jewish children from poor families with formal elementary school and vocational training. The Alliance continues to operate, it's still around, it continues to operate dozens of schools in Israel today. Apart from the work done by the Alliance, there are more than 800 Jewish day schools in the USA, with an enrollment of about 230,000 children. So in the USA, there are 800 Jewish schools with 230,000 children from age 4 to grade 12. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish children in the USA also attend religious, Hebrew and congregational schools. There are also 4 Jewish universities in the United States, as well as colleges. And Jewish studies is being taught at more than 19 universities throughout the whole country. Often, well, in all cases I would say, when Jewish studies or Hebrew or Yiddish is being taught at universities, it's through the funding of the community. It's not funded by the university. Same with Armenian. They're basically funded by endowments from wealthy people to these universities or from the communities. Apart from the Armenians and Jews, other examples abound, not the least the Coptic community, so Optaye, the Copts of Egypt, who not only have private schools in Australia, but they also fund Coptic studies, a Coptic studies centre, which actually teaches Coptic language and courses in Coptic history, at Macquarie University in Sydney. And they run 2 theological colleges, so 2 seminaries, one in Sydney and one in Melbourne. Student dormitories as well is a big thing. And it's very important because it actually not only encourages youngsters from a community to study at a university, and it provides them with a safe community or a safe environment in which to live and study, but it also lets other people know who these people are. I've actually stayed at this place. This is in Toronto. It's St. Vladimir Institute run by the Ukrainian community. It's not only student accommodation, it's got a theatre, it's got a hall, it's got a library, it's got a research centre, it's a one-stop shop. And anyone stays there. Everybody that works there is Ukrainian. And when they serve food to the students that actually stay there, it's all Ukrainian food. It was very interesting. Not only them, these are ones that we have in Sydney that belong to the Jewish community. You've got Mandelbaum House, Hillel House, Shalom Institute. They've all got student accommodation. And this is probably something that would be worth the Assyrians' while, somewhere here in the States or whether it be in Europe or Australia. Now, Assyrian education. It's obvious that the only way to preserve our language and culture in the diaspora is through the establishment of private day schools with a shared and standardized educational system and curriculum, linking them with one another. It would also be beneficial to establish Assyrian studies centers, institutes, libraries, and especially chairs at major universities where there are large Assyrian communities. Such accomplishments would only nurture pride and confidence, but would also foster greater dissemination of knowledge regarding the Assyrian culture, history, and language to both present and future generations. The Assyrians are a Middle Eastern people. Their past has been in the Middle East, and unless they establish a small state or autonomous region somewhere else or buy an island somewhere, their future should also be in the Middle East. Without maintaining links to the Middle East and maintaining communities and cultural monuments there, and nourishing their cultural and linguistic development, we are finished as a people. We also need to strengthen our educational and intellectual institutions in the diaspora through the establishment of more schools, libraries, research centres and chairs at universities, as well as student organisations. Consider the homeland as a cup full of water. Emigration from the homeland to the diaspora would be like pouring water from this cup into another one. Now, if that second cup has a hole in it, the water will eventually run out and it will be emptied. This is our situation right now if we don't try to close that gap through greater education. I started this talk with the saying, know thyself, Diaspora. If we do not start to learn about ourselves and become more confident and proud of our language and heritage, we will eventually cease to exist. Assyrians, both in the homeland and the diaspora, especially the latter, should aim at integrating themselves into the societies in which they live, but also creating institutions which would safeguard and preserve their language, culture and heritage and maintain links with the homeland, so we can uphold their human rights. Part of this would require adopting an open mind and creating an Assyrian national narrative and identity that is truly all-inclusive and respectful of the diverse dialects, traditions, sects, churches, foods, religions, costumes and regions that are part of the Assyrian homeland. They are us, and to know them is to know ourselves. To be truly patriotic or nationalistic, it should be the duty of every Assyrian to learn a dialect that is not their own, or to mix with Assyrians from other churches or from other religions, or to visit Assyrian communities in countries that they don't come from or their families don't originate from. Assyrians should also be active in recording their family trees and their oral histories, and actually acknowledging which villages and districts in the homeland they originate from. Moreover, diaspora Assyrians should not wait for unity. That can come afterwards. By keeping ourselves busy with the never-ending and emotion-charged topics of church politics and the name issue, Chaldean, Aramean, Assyrian, we're only wasting precious time, which we can use actually getting solid educations, establishing ourselves financially, and contributing not only to our societies which we live in, to infrastructure building in the homeland and educational projects, both in the homeland but also within our own communities, for our own people. Thank you very much. And yeah.
How Nicholas. We have time for maybe 10 minutes or so, the Shual Punai questions and answers. So itlan Bukhari Shual Manokhon, just Marmani Dokhon, or the microphone cut over. So.
Hi, I'm going to talk in English so that everybody understands. My name is Nora Adisho. I'm actually originally born and raised in Texas. This is my dad to the left of me. But my question for you is, when you talk about these schools, what are you envisioning? Because when I hear schools, I think of a lot of work in order to get them approved and institutionalized within, say, the USA system. Are you more thinking day-to-day schools that we send our children to every day, or are we thinking language schools, history, things like that?
Well, it depends on, can you hear me? Am I projecting my voice well? It depends on how much the community is willing to put forward in terms of time, effort and money. Obviously, the ideal situation would be to have day schools, day-to-day schools, Monday to Friday, because you know what? You take your kids to school, you don't see them for I don't know how many hours, from 9 till 3, or about 6 or 7 hours of the day. And if you work and you leave your children in after school care, well, you don't see them for longer. So that means that for that whole period, every day, 5 times a week, your children would be mixing with other Assyrian children. They'd be at an Assyrian school. They'd be learning Assyrian. You know, that's the difference between having a Monday to Friday school and to just having a language school 1 day a week for 3 hours. So, you know, when you say that it takes a lot of effort, yes, you have to get it registered, it takes a lot of time, it's time consuming. Guess what? Other people have done it before us. Why are we lazy? If other people have done it and can do it, we can do it too. And especially if Assyrians in Australia and Sweden have been able to do it. And if the Assyrians in Los Angeles were able to set it up for a short amount of time, I'm sure Assyrians in other parts of the US are able to do it.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Diana Benjamin. I was originally born in London, England, so I have a little bit of idea of the Assyrians based in the UK, but now I'm here in the US, I also have an idea of the communities out here. What are your suggestions? So with running the schools, I think one of our biggest things that you mentioned here is, the unity aspect. If we were to have these schools, I think that one of the biggest barriers is the divisions of who's running it and having these divisions. What would be some of your suggestions in people kind of overcoming those barriers?
Okay, I can talk to you from the experience of the Australian community. When Mohamedus opened up the Assyrian school in Sydney back in 2002, he copped a lot of flack from the community. Oh, why didn't you wait? Why didn't you unify with these people? They're not going to send their kids. Guess what? Everybody's sending their kids to the school because at the end of the day, they want their kids to learn the language. They know that they can't learn it anywhere else. You don't wait for unity. You create something. You create a dream. You have a dream, you go forward with it. Once you've done it, everybody else will come because they've got nothing else.
All right, that was an excellent question. Any other questions?
One question for you, Nick. I was born in Kirkuk, moved to London. My name is Tony Cass, and most of you know me. I've got a question for you, for the youth. There's a lot of youth here today, and what do you think they can do today? Obviously, they come to the schools, but there's something for them to do also. What is your advice for every single
I would say get involved as much as you can. Get involved in the community, get involved in your churches, get involved in your institutions, in your organizations. Try and be part of them. I'm very proud to have people like yourself, Tony, like Aturaya, like Joseph, like Ashur, and like, I can't remember the... Yes? Joe. Not Joe. Joe too, but also the young lady that I met from who's studying there, the Assyrian student. Lilia. I'm very proud of all of you. And this is what you should all be doing. This is a start. You start small. You have a dream, right? You keep that dream till maybe 10 or 20 years into the future. But as long as you start from something, and you don't forget, we're Assyrians, we need to stop assimilating with other people. We need to be proud of who we are, we need to be proud of where we come from, we need to be proud of our language, our heritage, our culture, and to learn more about it. And to actually try and bring about those circumstances which in the future will produce these. I mean, you never know, maybe there's a kid now who in 20 years' time will be quite a wealthy person or will be qualified to be a teacher in a private school, etc. Maybe people like you can influence your parents or your older generation to work towards things like this. But it's a team effort in any case.
Hi, is this good?
Yeah, it's fine.
Right. I'm Sleo Oshana, I'm originally from Chicago. I just had a couple questions if that was okay. Are there any existing databases of the Assyrian language, artifacts, that sort of thing, like you were mentioning for the Armenians, or is there one that has yet to be created?
That has yet to be created. There is no unified database of Assyrian monuments or Assyrian manuscripts or Assyrian anything. And that would require a lot of field work. I myself have done a lot of field work in Iran. I managed to document more than 2,300, as Joe was saying, more than 2,300 inscriptions. So from people's tombstones, from dedication inscriptions in churches, plaques, etc. I've also been able to document manuscripts in the various villages along the Khabar in Syria. But a lot more needs to be done.
Okay. In addition, I was also wondering, has there been any consideration of doing something like, say, a pen pal program using Skype or writing letters to Assyrian students or people in Iraq, in order to facilitate for the people who live out here, Europe, Asia, so that they can stay connected to the homeland, even if that's just one other way?
That's a very good idea, and I think, I'm not quite entirely sure, but I think there are Assyrian organizations that do that with some of the schools. I'm not sure, I'd have to check with the Assyrian Aid Society, because if anybody would know here in the United States, if something like that's been done, it's the Assyrian Aid Society. If they haven't, then I would suggest for you to get in touch with them, and maybe you can suggest that to them. Thank you. Any other questions? Not all at once. But no, I did have an interesting question. I did have sort of a side question. I recently found out through our conversations at the convention, and I think Fadi Dawud was the one who told me, at Arizona State University, there's an Armenian Studies chair, right? I told you that. Oh, you told me that, okay. An Armenian Studies chair. I don't know yet. I mean, I know we have a community here, but I'm not sure how large of a community it is. And as far as I know, I was shocked when I heard there's an Armenian Studies chair. How there can't be an Assyrian Studies chair at a university of equal size, whether it be in Phoenix or somewhere else, is shocking, because I don't think the Armenian community is that big here to support something like that. But what would be your suggestion? What's the best route, to establish something like that? Because I think that's a very noble endeavor.
You could speak to the Armenians. You could speak to the Armenian chair, or the lecturer that's actually the incumbent of the position here at the university. Maybe someone that could be representative of the Assyrian community or Assyrian students at ASU. You could go speak to that person and just say, look, we're thinking of maybe establishing an Assyrian studies chair here. We have some people that might be able to donate. How much would it cost? What would we need to do? Is there someone that we can talk to show us the steps that we need to go through? I think that's probably the best way to do it. And maybe also, take their advice. So that's one thing. Also, maybe try and get in contact directly with the university itself and see what it would take to establish an endowed chair, a community-funded chair. Maybe they can help you.
Okay, thank you very much. And if we don't have any more questions, also, we want to thank Lilia Mirza. I believe she was just elected to the Changemaker Central at ASU, nah? What position was it again? I can't remember.
The West Programming Chair.
West Programming Chair. So, Jonathan Zayani, with Changemaker ASU, which I remember before I graduated, I think they established it at Arizona State University. So, it's very impressive. Really, show typical at a university level. And her group helped sponsor this event at you. So, and Hawi Lochandana, Ktumach as Changemaker Central at ASU, and thank them for hosting this type of event at ASU, because it makes a difference in the community. Also, by membership applications by organization, the Assyrian American Cultural Organization of Arizona, and by Tunmani. Usually we try to have a general body meeting once a month. Activities, whatever, Phoenix. And then you also be on our email list. And also, Tawad journalist Nuri Kino in Sweden. We have them here. I have to double check how much we're selling them for, but if you're interested in them, any applications, membership as well. So, the book, from what Nuri told me, I haven't read it yet. I've only read a little bit. It's essentially like a fictional story about Iraq and the warring in the Middle East, and it's based on Nuri Kino's almost 2,000 interviews or something like that with people in the region. And from what I've heard, it's very good. I've only read a few pages into it. I've been busy with some other stuff right now, but I've heard it's a very, very good book, so I would highly recommend it. And I think I just want to, I'm going to how to thank you.